of northwestern China. In Chinese, Xinjiang means new frontier. But Xinjiang has an ancient history as a culturally diverse crossroads of trading in what the Chinese call the Silk Road, but which was actually more Iranian than Chinese. It was central to the ancient Persian trading areas called the Sogdian Network by historians. It has historically been home to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, but also to Mongolians, Indians, Greeks, Koreans, Buddhists, and Christians. Since at least the first East Turkestan Republic of 1933, it has been called East Turkestan. The Chinese Communist Party in Beijing has indiscriminately labeled Uyghurs who support an independent East Turkestan today as separatist and terrorist in their goals and means. The acronym of the Chinese Communist Party is the CCP. The CCP seeks to colonize and extinguish all linguistic, ethnic, and religious diversity in Xinjiang today in order to assimilate the territory under its own preferred Han Chinese race and their own atheist communist ideology. In the face of such extreme repression, some Uyghurs have indeed advocated separatism and utilized terrorism and violence, including street riots, as a means. But most of Beijing's rhetoric about violent Uyghur separatism is hypocritical and overblown. While most Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims arguably want independence, and understandably so, given extreme CCP human rights abuse in the region, the means utilized towards this end are overwhelmingly nonviolent, including Uyghur protests, advocacy for international sanctions, and public information campaigns. Given China's human rights abuse in Xinjiang and China's broader threat to democracy and human rights globally, the US and UK governments and allies should support nonviolent groups that support an independent East Turkestan. There are plenty of reasons to justify an independent East Turkestan, most clearly the CCP's increasingly intense ethnocide of Turkic Muslims in the region. The CCP has now detained between 1 and 3 million Turkic Muslims in re-education camps, according to the US government, and contrary to China's constitution, has forbidden use of Turkic Muslims' language and religion. The CCP has forced Muslims to eat pork and drink alcohol in a misguided and ill-fated attempt at assimilation. China's tactics in Xinjiang can only be classed among the most repressive cases of colonialism and imperialism in world history. These human rights violations are reason enough to support an independent East Turkestan. These were the topics of my recent writing for Yucca News, which I hope will be distributed to you after the talk by Tom. But here I want to push our thoughts further than these recent writings to talk about potential US and UK government support to non-violent Uyghur separatists who support an independent East Turkestan. Beyond the compelling human rights justification of an independent East Turkestan, there's another broader reason that should appeal to US and UK voters and policymakers, namely the global context of an increasingly powerful and threatening CCP. The global context of this CCP growing power is critical to understanding potential US and UK support for Uyghur separatism. And so I must establish those facts here before returning to the subject at hand. The CCP's power has grown exponentially since it was founded on July 1, 1921 in Shanghai. It has grown in geographic extent within China from the Russian-supported Jiangxi Soviet of 1931 in the hills of the southeast to the retreat, also known as the Long March, to Shaanxi province from 1934 to 1935. Then during the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 45, the CCP watched as Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists weakened, but ultimately defeated the Japanese with US and Allied assistance. Between 1945 and 1949, the Soviet-supported CCP came back to destroy the US Allied nationalists and take over the entire country. The Soviets then betrayed the Uyghurs in the northeast in preference to the Chinese communists. The rest of the war-weary world rapidly recognized the CCP as the new government in 1950 in order to continue and expand hundreds of millions of pounds worth of trade and investment in China. The CCP then sought to use its growing power from trade to export its communist influence to Malaya, Vietnam, and the Philippines, causing independence in Malaya in 1957, a unified communist Vietnam in 1975, and most recently with the election of Duterte, a pro-Beijing Manila in 2016. This is a partial list of China's continued growing influence in Asia. Meanwhile, the CCP's control of citizens within its borders has grown, including through technological innovations like the social credit score, which relies on big data and artificial intelligence to track and rank its citizens' loyalty to the Communist Party. Citizens with low social credit scores are deprived of access to loans and travel, even within China. Their children are deprived of quality education and loans in the form of collective familial punishment. China now threatens to extend its social control and influence beyond Southeast Asia and into Africa, Latin America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand through its One Belt, One Road development program known as OBOR. 2 days ago, on March 23, Italy, a G7 country and EU member, officially signed on to China's OBOR, which offers trillions of dollars in development funding linked to bribery, corruption, debt traps, and checkbook diplomacy. China is seeking to influence not just Italy, but the entire EU through Italy's inclusion. Italy has a veto at the EU on policies of interest to China, and countries like Greece and Hungary that are close to China have already used their EU vetoes against condemnation of China's human rights abuse and territorial aggression. China is using its rapidly growing wealth to influence the world's elite universities, including here at Oxford and my alma mater, Yale, where I got my PhD at Harvard. A CCP foundation donated $350 million to Harvard in 2014, which it got from what appears to be shell companies in the British Virgin Islands and Monaco. At the same time, a Chinese military-linked company donated $10 million to Harvard, which was used for PLA officer fellowships. PLA is the People's Liberation Army. The CCP's growing footprint in academia and geographically, its increasing control of its own people, and now its influence abroad threatens human rights and democracy globally. The CCP is therefore a threat and an enemy to free thought and democracy that we must weaken if we want to protect freedom and human rights globally. There are many strategies to weaken the CCP, including military, economic, and diplomatic strategies. China can and should be deprived of technology, markets, and diplomatic access at places like the UN and International Criminal Court. US, Japan, and India are militarily confronting China's attempts to change the territorial status quo in the South and East China Seas and in the Himalayan mountains. I edited a book on the South China Sea recently that was published by US Naval Institute Press. But we might also seek to weaken the CCP internally. The CCP might, for example, be deprived of access to what it considers to be Chinese territory in order to weaken its growing power. That territory could include Xinjiang and Tibet. As the focus of this talk is on Xinjiang, I will focus there. We might, through making East Turkestan independent, thereby weaken the CCP and improve the prospects for democracy and human rights, not only in Xinjiang, but around the world. US and UK governments, along with most of their NATO and Asian allies, are increasingly seeing China as an enemy. These allies might at some point decide to endorse such a strategy of an independent East Turkestan, which can be achieved by economically and diplomatically supporting non-violent Uyghur separatists. There are many other countries upon which China has forced land, maritime, and water disputes that might also be expected to have an interest in weakening the CCP by supporting an independent East Turkestan. China seeks to take territory, including of the maritime variety, from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, and Bhutan. China seeks to divert water from Tibet to Xinjiang, for example, which will hurt downstream countries that currently benefit by water flows off the Tibetan Plateau. These downstream countries include Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh, all of which should have an interest in restoring Tibet and East Turkestan's independence. Turkey, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan are ethnically close to the repressed Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. These countries too have reason to want to weaken China's power and secure the religious and linguistic rights of their ethnic brethren within China's current borders. But there are substantial and possibly conclusive risks associated with the potential strategy of US and UK government support to nonviolent Uyghur separatists. Most likely, the CCP could and likely would fight locally against such separatists, causing massive human costs in terms of lives and refugee flows from the region. China's current ethnocide in Xinjiang could rise to the level of genocide. The CCP could also see outside support to nonviolent separatists as an act of war, thus risking a larger military conflict that could escalate into a general US-China war, including use of nuclear weapons. China's version of deterrence historically has not respected the international legal principle of proportionality. Were China to win against nonviolent Uyghur separatists, it could actually strengthen the CCP, both materially and in its resolve to protect itself from future such internal threats, including through domination of international relations globally, which it arguably already seeks. So what we are discussing today is a policy option that is infrequently discussed publicly because it is such a dangerous option. Were China to believe that it were a serious option, China might seek to protect itself immediately by increasing repression of Turkic Muslims even more thoroughly than it is doing today. So there are costs to even discussing this publicly. But allowing the CCP to continue its repression of the Uyghurs and unfettered growth of its power within China's current borders is also a dangerous policy. Thus, the US and UK governments are in a bind. Support to nonviolent Uyghur separatists who limit their nonviolent protests to locations outside of Xinjiang would be one way out of this bind. It would limit blowback against Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang while simultaneously increasing global public education and about the plight of Uyghurs and support for economic and individual sanctions on China, Xi Jinping, and other top Chinese officials that might lead to improved treatment of Turkic Muslims in China or an independent East Turkestan. Either outcome would go a long way towards decreasing global military tensions. It is critical at the outset of any discussion on Uyghur separatism to analytically define and differentiate between separatism, insurgency, and terrorism. I define them along with nonviolence as the following. Separatism is the advocacy of or practice of separation of a certain group of people from a larger body. Terrorism is the non-state use of violence against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. Insurgency is an active revolt or uprising. Nonviolence is the use of peaceful means, not force, to bring about political or social change. China will seek to equate separatism with terrorism and violent insurgency, but this is not always the case. It is possible to have a purely nonviolent separatism, and this nonviolent separatism is the kind that we here can support. What we are discussing today is therefore not US and UK government support to terrorism, which targets civilians with violence, but the policy option of US and UK government support to nonviolent separatists. One goal of such a US and UK government policy would be to decrease existing Uyghur use of terrorism and redirect such violent energies towards nonviolent approaches. There are currently violent Uyghur groups that could potentially be turned towards nonviolence. In July 2016, the UK government proscribed the Turkestan Islamic Party, TIP, as a terrorist group. It operates in Pakistan, Syria, and China. TIP is also banned by the UN and sanctioned by the US under the terrorist exclusion list. TIP is also known as the East Turkestan Islamic Party, ETIP, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, and Hizb al-Islami al-Turkestani, HAAT. These groups could and should be turned towards nonviolent means, and after proving to have given up violence through publicly stated commitments to nonviolence and proven sustained use of nonviolent means, applications could be submitted on their behalf to the UN, US, and UK to remove the groups from the banned lists. A similar process is being supported to turn the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, from an insurgent group into a nonviolent electoral party. This attempt to turn insurgents into regular nonviolent citizens was institutionalized in NATO's reintegration campaign when I worked for NATO in Afghanistan from 2011 to 13. The proposal to turn Uyghur terrorists into nonviolent activist groups is much more pacific in means than what we have seen in historical cases of major enemy powers that seek to use internal elements to destabilize each other through state sponsorship of violent insurgency or terrorism. State sponsorship of foreign domestic interest groups, separatists, insurgents, and terrorists has a long history. These non-state actors are frequently called freedom fighters and encouraged to carry out violent acts and used as weapons against rival powers and hegemons. The result is typically a humanitarian disaster for the internal populations used for such purposes and internal instability or even disintegration of the enemy state. This can be seen as a successful warfighting strategy, but the costs in terms of civilian casualties can be massive. The tactic extends back in history to ancient Greece. In the 430s BCE, the powerful cities of Corinth and Corcyra were competitors. The weak city of Epidamnus lay between the two and was the object of a battle in which both sides utilized domestic factions against the other. The Corinthians supported democratic rebels against exiled aristocrats. The Corcyrians, in turn, allied with the aristocrats. The Corcyrians won the naval battle that followed and restored the aristocrats to power. They slew all their captives other than the Corinthians, who they held as hostages. Corinth was an ally to powerful Sparta, so Corcyra joined a democratic but imperialist Athens as an ally. This incident begins the history of the Peloponnesian War, which autocratic Sparta and her independent allies won in 404 BCE. This theme of using domestic interests against any enemy recurs in American and British history. The French supported the American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 83 against Great Britain. It resulted in an independent United States of America and the breakup of the British Empire, the start of a breakup of the British Empire. There were about 24,000 British casualties, including wounded, and about 23,800 American deaths, not including wounded. The Cold War between the US, Russian, and Chinese communists has a long history of these states supporting rebels in each other's countries and among each other's allies. In 1951, the CCP invaded Tibet. By 1956, Tibetan rebels were killing CCP officials in Han Chinese, and in 1959, the CIA was training Tibetan rebels in Colorado. That effort ended in 1972 with President Nixon's thaw of relations with the CCP. From 1951 to 1984, Tibetan government and exile sources claimed that over 1.2 million Tibetans died of unnatural causes. 432,000 killed in uprisings, 342,000 starved to death, 173,000 died in prison, 156,000 executed, 92,000 tortured to death, and 9,000 committed suicide. This comes close to a form of genocide and well illustrates the risks of encouraging separatism in Xinjiang today. From 1979 to 1989, the U.S. supported the Mujahideen insurgents in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation. Pakistan and China helped the U.S. and the Mujahideen. 1 million Afghan civilians died, along with 90,000 Mujahideen, 18,000 Afghan troops, and 14,500 Soviet soldiers. After Soviet withdrawal, a civil war raged and the Taliban took over in 1996. They supported international terrorism, including Al-Qaeda's Osama bin Laden, and in 2001, the current war in Afghanistan started. It's still going, as we all know. From 1981 to 1986, the Reagan administration supported the Nicaraguan Contras with money, arms, and equipment. These Contras operated against the communist Sandinista government, which itself supported communist rebels in El Salvador. According to human rights groups, the Contras used terrorist tactics to cause the Nicaraguan population not to support the Sandinista government. The ceasefire in 1988 led to internationally monitored elections in 1990. The Sandinistas won after approximately 30,000 Nicaraguans died and many more were wounded. There are also historical cases of foreign support to Uyghur separatists in China, much of it successful. As early as 1871, Russia has sought to occupy and influence parts of East Turkestan. At this time, Russia and Britain supported the Muslim separatist Yaqub Beg with arms and commercial agreements. Stalin followed the same path, supporting not only Muslim separatists in the northwest, but Mao's communist forces in southeast China, all of whom weakened Chinese nationalists. Stalin is even credited with constructing Uyghur identity from traces of historical roots by cobbling together many diverse Turkic Muslim identities that were not Uyghur under that unifying ethnic identity. The Soviet Union also supported the first East Turkestan Republic of 1933-4 and the second East Turkestan Republic of 1944-50. Stalin decreased pressure on the Chinese nationalists when he needed them to help fight the Japanese from 1937 to 45. But when the Japanese were defeated, he no longer needed Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalists or the Uyghurs. He then betrayed them both in preference for Mao and the Chinese communists, who were ideologically allied to Russian communism. The first and second East Turkestan republics required military force within territory now controlled by the CCP. Attempting a similar military approach to an independent East Turkestan today would play to China's strengths and China's preferred battlefield. There is no easy way to defeat China's massive conventional army in Xinjiang today using Uyghur separatists. At best, it would result in stalemate, as happened in Afghanistan and Vietnam, and the deaths of at least 1 million Turkic Muslims. there are smarter ways to beat the CCP and achieve an independent East Turkestan today. US, UK, and allied governments can support these smarter nonviolent methods to achieve an independent East Turkestan. These include 1, public education about the CCP's atrocities in Xinjiang, 2, human rights advocacy in international fora like the UN and ICC, 3, which, by the way, China is trying to stop, so they use every trick in the book to stop any kind of human rights advocacy at the UN and ICC that affects China. 3, provision of international asylum to Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. 4, economic sanctions against Chinese companies, Xi Jinping and other top Chinese CCP officials. And 5, support to nonviolent organizing, protests, and activism by Uyghurs abroad, including an increasing number of asylum seekers and refugees. These nonviolent tactics are critical to forestalling the radicalization of Uyghurs abroad, who are highly vulnerable to terrorist recruiting. Separatism is seen by the Chinese authorities as tantamount to treason, insurgency, and even terrorism. The categories are fused and interrelated from Beijing's viewpoint, and so drastic repressive measures are justified in their minds, even against nonviolent advocacy of an independent East Turkestan. This is quite different from the approach of Western democracies to separatism. In the UK, Canada, and Spain, nonviolent advocacy of an independent Scotland, Quebec, or Catalonia is accepted as a legitimate part of the public discourse. These states even allow votes on independence for these regions. The repressive nature of the CCP state makes the demand and appeal of independence stronger than in Western democracies, but it also makes the likely repression against the nonviolent demand for such independence more devastating. The human cost of a possible genocide in Xinjiang, in which millions could die, cannot be discounted. Many Uyghurs suspect that such a genocide has already begun. That an ethnocide has begun is beyond doubt. A nonviolent independence movement in East Turkestan, if institutionalized through state support from the US and UK, could increase the likelihood of such a genocide, followed by consolidation of CCP state power in Xinjiang. This could make China stronger than it is now. The bottom line is that violent separatism within Xinjiang would very likely lead to a bloodbath or even genocide of the Turkic Muslims. Nonviolent separatism outside China, using the powerful tactics of economic sanctions, boycotts, and nonviolent direct action, are arguably more effective and safer for Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. These latter nonviolent tactics aim to utilize world public opinion and the good services of democracies and allied nations worldwide to economically and publicly isolate and pressure China to improve the plight of Turkic Muslims and eventually provide them with cultural, religious, ethnic, and linguistic rights and an independent East Turkestan. With that, I thank you for your patience and am happy to take questions. And by the way, questions can go on as long as an hour, but if you need to leave, don't feel hindered. I have a thick skin and I'm happy to let people know whenever they want to in the middle of questioning. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take. Yep.
So groups like the ETIM, they have very strong links to groups like Al-Qaeda and other radical Islamic groups. How can the US make sure that they don't inadvertently end up supporting Islamic extremism when supporting these groups?
I think that's a risk, and I think we've seen it in Syria, where US and Saudi support to rebels or freedom fighters in Syria against the Assad regime there's possible overlap with groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and things like that. But I think that's a risk. But the goal would be to first turn these groups nonviolent, ensure that they are nonviolent, both through their public statements and through their actions. And only after that would you sort of list them as terrorist groups and start supporting them. You can also support, meanwhile, there are many other Uyghur groups that should be supported that are totally nonviolent and that also advocate a independent East Turkestan. Yes?
So I'm just kind of basically speculating as to your position here a little bit. So what is your kind of key motivation? Is it is it to combat Chinese influence and growing influence by attacking them domestically at home? I mean, and obviously, it's also quite a radical move, obviously, to kind of threaten Chinese territorial integrity on the mainland in a way. I mean, like, I'm aware of many other kind of, campaigns, so even with the Free Tibet movement, the last kind of 3 decades, I mean, there was never any kind of, as far as I recall, genuine international intervention or supporting of kind of movements on the ground. So, I mean, why would you kind of advocate maybe Uyghur separatists over kind of supporting Tibetan separatists? I don't know, maybe perhaps you do. This is obviously.
No, I support both separatists for 2 reasons. There's the human rights reason that Tibetans and Uyghurs are suffering under what's truly an ethnocide. I mean, they're really trying to erase the ethnic, linguistic, and religious identity of these groups. That's close to a global atrocity against humanity, crime against humanity. So that would be the first human rights reason. But the other reason is that China is becoming so powerful and dangerous that we need to think outside the box in terms of our strategies about how to combat China's growing power. In the 50s, the CIA did have a very robust campaign in Tibet of supporting violent rebels against the CCP. As I mentioned, that ended in over 1.2 million deaths of Tibetans in atrocious circumstances. So I don't think that was a good strategy. It failed. I think a similar strategy in East Turkestan today would fail. So I don't support any kind of support I wouldn't support a similar kind of a tactic, but I would support a nonviolent movement that kept itself outside of East Turkestan and used protest strategies, boycotts, economic sanctions. I mean, it's the nonviolent movement, people's movement, could be boycotts and protests. On the government side, you could have increased economic sanctions. People like Xi Jinping, Chen Guangguo, the guy who runs Xinjiang right now and is in charge. In the past, he did a lot of repression of the Tibetans and the Falun Gong movement, and so he's sort of like a top guy that should be sanctioned quickly. And actually, there's a movement in the U.S. Congress to sanction him specifically. They haven't taken the step of sanctioning Xi Jinping, who's ultimately responsible and who's calling the shots, because he's current head of state. I think it's difficult to do that. But personally, I think we should go ahead and sanction Xi Jinping as well.
And so I just want to kind of branch into 2 other little bits from that. Why do you think, do you not think it would be threatening to an Uyghur cause, for example, to associate themselves with international actors? Do you not think that might weaken their domestic position, especially considering maybe some of the Western track records? I mean, even with kind of Kurdish advocacy, as soon as it seems to conflict with nominal kind of national interests of the US or Russia, for example. I mean, obviously, affiliates and non-affiliates, but you've kind of abandoned the Kurdish separatists in Afghan as the Turkish operational branch just going to move through the area, and this kind of like track record of basically will support you on the international stage until it's basically no longer clearly in our national interest. I mean, do you think that might not be harmful to an Uyghur cause? And then surely the Chinese state would be quite violent in our opposition to any kind of international advocacy. There's other net levers that the Chinese state use, obviously, with the South China Sea especially. Surely there will be a counter-reaction and maybe a tightening of kind of. What do you see as the kind of counter-reaction to something like international advocacy?
Well, if what I'm proposing is that the nonviolent Uyghur activism happen outside of China. So there's not much the Chinese can do. If someone's active here in Oxford, they can't really do anything. If someone's active in the U.S., they can't do anything. It can upset them, certainly, but I think they can't do much in terms of repression and violence. In terms of the U.S. turning its back at some future date on its support, also, again, if the support is being given to nonviolent activists outside the country, a change in support, a lack of U.S. support in future after supporting now isn't going to hurt them much. We build them up now, we leave them, they're still built up. They still have that extra power they had. The difference from Kurdistan or Kurdish regions is because Kurdistan or the Kurdish area is a regional, is geographic region that has to be defended. If they're relying on U.S. support to defend that region, and then the U.S. support is pulled, then the enemy troops come in and wipe out the Kurds. But since there's no actual territory being defended, in the case of nonviolent Uyghur groups outside of China, there's not the kind of risk that we see in Kurdistan.
Thank you for talking. It's been really interesting. I'm interested in the appetite for the advocacy at the moment.
The what?
The appetite for it at the moment within the US itself and maybe in the UK. So for me, it doesn't really. I really like your idea. I think it's an interesting concept, but the appetite for advocacy at the moment, especially in regards to human rights in Britain and the US, doesn't really seem that big at the moment. We all seem very self-involved and with both the US administration and British government at the time. And also, I kind of want to look back at sort of 2017 and the Rohingya crisis, and there really didn't seem to me like there was much Western reaction to that. So, how do you see that we could build up that sort of appetite for it? So I think it's a really important thing to be pushing. I just don't see how we can build it up at the moment.
I think you're right. There isn't enough appetite right now. There should be more. But if you compare today to during the Obama administration, for example, you see a much bigger appetite in the U.S. government to take on China. I mean, it's night and day. And we're seeing more of that now. Actually, there's going to be news coming out today about a lot of influential people in the U.S. government, in the U.S. who are doing something new. So I can't release that. You'll see if you look for it, you'll see it in the news tonight around 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But there's a growing interest in the U.S. government and outside of the U.S. government in D.C. to take on China much more seriously. And I think in the EU too, we see, with the exception of Italy, which has just gone over to the Chinese side a little bit, I think we're seeing more of an interest in and worry about China's threats and influence to the EU, both through technology capture and other things. So because we're worrying now more about China, there's going to be more incentive to support internal domestic groups in China that might destabilize the CCP and ultimately lead to democratization of China or the removal of Xi Jinping, who seems to be central to a lot of the most aggressive of China's moves internationally. But I think it's events like this, and if you guys agree with what I'm saying, it's taking this to the next level to your friends and organizing things. Yes.
So a conservative economist from America called Alex Epstein has written a book, and in it says something along the lines of, if we're to take the sort of scaremongering about global warming seriously, then China poses an economic threat to the point where the US should be at war because of the kind of scale of pollution that they're doing to the atmosphere compared to every other country. Do you think that this kind of threat is creditable, and what do you think based on that statement?
Well, China and India, I think, are the two of the world's leading countries in terms of emissions. And as they ramp up their economies and people start buying more cars and air conditioners and taking more international flights, they're going to be even more of a threat to the environment. So I think I think that it is a very serious issue. The U.S. and Europe, of course, have the highest per capita rates of emissions. So we're also culpable but it's a very thorny ethical issue, you know. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge threat. So we shouldn't see economic growth of China as a very, very good thing, because it's leading to both global warming and it's enabling their military. Their military is then being used against the U.S. and its allies in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. I mean, you've got hundreds of flights every year that China and Russia are sending off into, you know, over the Senkaku Islands that are owned by Japan as a way to threaten Japanese territorial sovereignty. And what the Chinese are trying to do is take little bits of territory, it's called salami slicing in strategy, or incrementalism, just enough so that we don't react defensively, but that always grows their power. And in the South China Sea, it's quite a big chunk of salami, because there's up to $60 trillion of oil and gas in the South China Sea by Chinese estimates at $100 a barrel, which is more than, I think, the market price now, but still, the market price could rise back to that level. And in addition to oil, there's lots of fishing and transit. 1/3 of the world's, the value of maritime transit goes through the South China Sea. So what we're seeing with China's rise is really quite dangerous. And China is now using its economic power to influence international institutions at the UN and World Bank and elsewhere, and even to try to replace international institutions with new institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is sort of China's counterpart to the World Bank. And to promote things like democracy with Chinese characteristics. We all know that China is a dictatorship. We all know that when China promotes human rights with Chinese characteristics, it's really only about development. And in China, the distribution of wealth is actually as bad as in the US. So it's not like it's an equal distribution of wealth. So what we're seeing is a huge danger, which is why something like supporting Turkestan or Tibetan independence makes sense from a geopolitical strategic perspective. I'll go with you.
Feel free to disagree, but I would say ethno-nationalism is very much a trait that's pervasive in the Han Chinese psyche. So how do you feel injecting China with...
How do I feel what?
How do you feel that, you know, injecting China with Western democracy, a bit with a Chinese twist, how do you feel about changing the landscape within China at the moment?
Well, I agree with the first part that you said, that ethno-nationalism, I mean, it's very much Han nationalism in China, and that's part of why they're trying to wipe out other ethnic, the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. I agree with that part. So, what was your second part? How do you feel about promoting
My
democracy?
point is, how would promoting the idea of democracy in China change the landscape? Because it extends beyond other people in the Asian continent. You highlighted upon this where China was going into places like Kenya and Africa in general in response to natural land. I think there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that the Chinese, specifically the Han Chinese, have got such negative views of the people, specifically Africans, and there's a lot of literature that supports that. How do you feel you can dismantle some of those views within China, then promote the idea of democracy, maybe even equality? How do you feel the world should go about doing that?
I think it's a slow process. I think China is terrified that they're going to become the next Soviet Union that breaks up and there's chaos. And I mean, the Soviet Union is now far weakened compared to Russia. Is now a much weaker country than the Soviet Union was, both economically and militarily. So China's worried about that. They don't want to break up. They're arguably everything that the CCP does is geared towards maintaining its own power. So it's not easy, and it would take time. And in the past, we've tried what's called engagement, which is we have academics going to China and talking to them. We bring the Chinese to the U.S. and the UK and encourage them to think in terms of democratic terms. But most China watchers and China specialists now believe that engagement failed, The CCP is too powerful and strong in China. So when people return from their studies here, instead of bringing back democracy, they're bringing back technology and scientific techniques that then empower the CCP. And meanwhile, Chinese business operating in the US is influencing our elites because our elites make money. I mean, David Cameron just, when he left office, he just started a consulting firm that basically promotes, or he somehow is involved in supporting the One Belt, One Road program in terms of looking for investments, something like that. So the danger is that they're influencing us more than we're influencing them. Yes.
So I'm coming at this from the angle a bit of layman, so be patient with me. So I've been educating myself on various issues via YouTube for the past year or so, including the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is fascinating, abstract of any political sort of implications I might have. And I, before coming here, I had a short look at a video, a documentary on YouTube about the Uyghurs, and it gives across such a blatant point of view about how they're being subjugated, about how it's just this huge violation of human rights. And I feel like I'm not the only person who does that. There are thousands and thousands, whatever quantity of people who also choose to do that. You talk about engagement, and I was wondering if maybe, instead of trying to engage with Chinese or the other nations, why not try to engage with the nations who have open access to online media? I mean, I'm not sure what efforts you guys are putting into in terms of creating an online information source that is easier than I just I mean, I know myself, I can't read the legislation, it bores me, enormously. And tying into the economics and the environmental changes, if, by my understanding, people will choose to put their money where their beliefs are. Some people will, some people won't. I mean, people boycotted Nestle when they found out about the breast milk thing, and I suspect that perhaps people will do it again if they found out about China and all of their exploits of human rights. So maybe they movements to maybe increase awareness of the situation by educating people in the democratized world.
Right, I absolutely agree. I think there are actually quite a few efforts to do that, so, and I think there should be more. So I agree with you. Yeah, does that answer your question?
More than wondering what sort of governmental bodies have we put in place, or what they're trying to put in place.
Well, so for example, one thing the U.S. is doing is Radio Free Asia, which is very effective. They've actually hired a lot of Uyghurs as reporters who can speak Uyghur, and they call back. They're able to call into China and talk to people, the Uyghurs themselves, but they're also able to talk to guards in the re-education camp. So they actually find out a lot of information on the phone just by calling. And then they publish all that information. So on the Uyghur situation, the Radio Free Asia is one of the best out there, and it's U.S. government supported. Sure.
Okay. Suggestion, I mean, just I'm coming from the younger generation. I don't really listen to radio. I mean, sometimes I listen to podcasts.
Well, it's all online.
Yeah, it's all online, but
I mean, it's like articles.
I feel like if you take a step further and sort of create some documents, like make a piece of artwork, something that people want to digest.
Right.
That would make a huge difference to the fight.
I agree. Yeah, that's a great. You should start something like that. Yeah, we'll pop over here. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, English is not my first language, so I haven't caught everything that you read. This is my problem. But regarding the human rights, in these days, the Chinese president is in Europe, and he spent quite 3 days in Italy, and now he's in France, meeting French president and the German one. The debate in Italy is only regarding how good because it is there for economic deals, of course, for the Silk Road that is going to cross from Asia to come into Italy to Europe for trade. And so the main issue about the Italian debate, probably in most part of Europe, is who will get the best deal with China. Some only few people that mentioned regarding the human rights that we are dealing with someone who's killing other people that are innocent. It's a very feeble protest. It's a very light, very quick voice. So it makes me thinking that in some way for the powerful, the main thing is the trade, is to get there. And but my question is, will one day be trapped inside this kind of philosophy? And this is a big risk. So my fantasy, I was just fantasizing, thinking, yes, probably for the US a strong Europe altogether can be a danger, yeah, can be a threat, because it can be a strong pole for business, but couldn't be useful for USA to make Europe again, because at the moment it is quite fragmented, to make Europe, to support Europe in the effort to be united, because the unity of Europe will help to contrast the big influence of China. I hope I've been clear.
Yes, you're very clear, and I agree with you 100% that it's in U.S. interests to have a strong Europe and a united Europe and an enlarged Europe that is democratic. As long as it's democratic, there's no reason why there's no threat, which is one reason why democratizing China is so important. Because if you can't democratize China, it remains a threat. And in the nuclear age, countries that threaten each other go to war against each other. And just because we have nuclear weapons does not mean that there will not be a war. There's always been, wars have always increased in ferocity over history. And they increased exponentially in ferocity. So World War II was 10 times worse than World War I, and World War I was 10 times worse than the Napoleonic Wars, et cetera, going back into history. So it's increasingly important that Europe be strong, united, powerful. I think Europe needs a single foreign policy. I think it needs a single, I agree totally with Macron that it needs a single military. And as far as, are you Italian, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. As far as Italy goes, and what we've seen in history is that China's One Belt, One Road program and development offerings are always linked to other things. There's a lot of evidence of Chinese government entities bribing the heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, etc., to get what they want. So the deals that are signed between countries in China are often not in the interest of the country signing the deal. They're in the interest of China. And the only reason why you have a head of state sign such a deal, a bad deal, is because they've been bribed in some way. And that bribery can take many forms. It can take the form of a consulting contract after the head of state leaves office. Yeah. It can take the form of speaking fees, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. It can take the form of contracts to family members of former heads of state. And Kevin Rudd, who's knocks around Oxford once in a while, he's doing a PhD actually currently at Oxford University, but Kevin Rudd's daughter makes money in China, right? There's, a lot of the leaders, and I'm not saying there's any corruption there, but that's the kind of mechanism that could be used if China wanted to do it. And there's absolutely every reason for China to seek to use that type of lever. In the Philippines, we see that the people closest to President Duterte, who are making a lot of money, hundreds of, they're making millions of dollars in contracts from Chinese deals, are very close to Duterte and his family. So it's a real danger to democracy, and China's playing a very smart game to try to integrate very closely with the elites and the leaders of our democratic countries. And it's highly dangerous to democracy, and it totally flies beneath the radar of most people who are watching on a day-to-day basis. And it might seem weird to us that our presidents, who are supposed to support human rights and democracy, are so chummy and friendly with Xi Jinping, who's one of the worst out there in terms of human rights and democracy. It can really only be explained, I think, by forms of side payments, and it doesn't necessarily have to be direct bribery of cash to the head of state, though that has happened in the past, including piles and piles of cash being brought in big packages of, someone was just, Patrick Ho was just sentenced to, I think, several years in prison in the U.S. for such kinds of corruption. That happened today. But it can also be through these side payments to family members through business deals. So democracies have to get much smarter in terms of how they, not allowing their elected leaders to do business with China and its closest allies. Yeah.
So you mentioned democracy should get a lot smarter. Is this not kind of an implication of perhaps that democracy could well be part of the problem in a way? Because if you kind of assess the fact that people like Frederick Hayek, for example, have been predicting that this kind of state like China is going to exist sometime in the future for perhaps upwards of 80 years at this point, and yet we as democratic nations have done practically nothing about it. And do you think that's possibly a problem with either the baby boomers or democracy?
Yes. I mean, I think democracy is a very permeable institution by design. We're very open. We're very friendly. We allow people in. We allow people out. I mean, democracies today could be the Native Americans of yesterday, and the new conquistadors are the Chinese, and they take advantage of our openness, to essentially conquer us and colonize us. So that's what they've done in Xinjiang province. That's what they've done in Tibet, and that's arguably they're following the same playbook globally now with One Belt, One Road. I'll take you in the far back.
Thank you. If you talk about, you mentioned the oil and natural gas reserves in the South China Sea. Are those reserves exploitable? Are they commercially viable? And would that then reduce the vulnerability of China to the closing of the Malaya Straits?
Closing of which straits?
The Malaya Straits? Sorry, Malaccan Straits.
Right. I think a lot of those are unproven reserves, so we don't know how much is really under there. And they're based on very rough estimates. The $60 trillion number is the maximum number that could possibly be at this point, with the estimates that we have at $100 a barrel. But yeah, I mean, part of the reason I think why China is focusing so much on the South China Sea is they see it as, they don't have a very good domestic source of oil. They have some shale in the territory, but it's very hard to get out with the amount of water that they have. They just don't have the water necessary to get that oil out of the ground. We in the U.S. have a lot of shale, but we also have a lot of water, which we use to force the shale oil out of the ground. Chinese don't have that. So the South China Sea provides one source of domestic oil if they can truly capture it, which they're trying hard to do. I'll take you in the green shirt. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. And my question is going to be concerning everyone's favourite second China, Taiwan. It in January, obviously, Xi Jinping was talking about Taiwanese independence, and how the dream is dead, and how he not very subtly indicates he wants to take back Taiwan. Equally, I believe just yesterday or earlier, the US, as they are approaching trade talks with China, they actually promised Taiwan to send in couple dozen military jets, and equally they sent several battleships down Taiwanese Strait. So what is the risk to investments in Indian security that there could be a proxy war in Taiwan as Taiwanese independence concludes? Thank you.
There's definitely a risk of, I think Taiwan is the thing that the CCP wants the most at this point. Now that they have Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet, their next biggest goal, in addition maybe to the South China Sea, which is much harder to secure. The South China Sea is as big as India, so it's very hard to secure. It's twice the size of the Mediterranean. But Taiwan is conquerable for the Chinese, possibly. So we could very well see. And also Taiwan is dangerous for the CCP because it is an example of an ethnic Chinese Han society that is highly successful. It's very economically powerful on a per capita basis. It's much wealthier on a per capita basis than China, and it's democratic. And so it's a counterexample to the CCP approach that should make regular Chinese on the mainland want a different system, more like Taiwan. So China really wants to take over Taiwan, and the U.S. really wants to save Taiwan, both because Taiwan is a longtime ally of the U.S. and also for the precise reasons that China doesn't like Taiwan, which is that Taiwan can destabilize China as a democratic example, and all of these Chinese speakers can be used to influence China as well. So the big question in the U.S. Security community right now is how do we support Taiwan without provoking China to invade and without creating a war. China wants to make us think that it's going to go to war over Taiwan if we support it or if Taiwan declares independence. We're not so sure. We think maybe Taiwan could declare independence and China is bluffing. Maybe we can put more than just those jets in. Maybe we can put hundreds or thousands of U.S. troops into Taiwan at the invitation of Taiwan. Maybe we can encourage Taiwan to obtain its own independent nuclear deterrent so that if China attacked, Taiwan would have the option of retaliating with a nuclear weapon, which probably would protect Taiwan in perpetuity from any sort of a Chinese invasion. So those are the big questions about Taiwan. But it's a very dangerous situation. I think it's especially dangerous since we haven't done enough. I think once we have U.S. troops in the country, like South Korea, if we're able to give Taiwan its own nuclear deterrent, I think we would then see a much more stable East Asia, and China would actually end up giving up on invading Taiwan eventually. Yes?
So, regarding Central Asian states, they've been big recipients of Belt and Road, the funds from the Asian Investment Bank, and what have you. In fact, it was even launched in Astana, sort of signifying its importance to China. What policy should the United States be pursuing towards the Central Asian states? Should it be looking at them as potential partners to contain China, or then you also have the problems of provoking Russia and Iran, who are big players in the region? How can the US navigate the internal politics of the region to prevent the Chinese expanding and gaining control of the energy resources in Central Asia?
I actually think that Russia is a natural ally to the U.S. against China, which may explain part of why Trump has been tried to be friendly to Russia. At the same time, Russia is selling a lot of oil and gas to China, so Russia doesn't want to upset China as its main client. That oil and gas has very few other places to go since we're sanctioning Russia so heavily over the Crimea issue. But I think privately, Russia doesn't like China. I think privately, Russia is worried of Chinese colonialism in Eastern Russia. In Eastern Russia, they just don't have that much of a population of Russians. So there's a big risk of the Chinese actually colonizing or influencing some of those eastern states over the coming decades, and even those states breaking off of Russia at some point. So there's that. In terms of Central Asia, I think the U.S. And Russia should try to support those countries against Chinese influence. I think we should try to counter any attempts by China to influence them economically. So if China is offering a loan of, $10 billion to Central Asian republics at 2% interest, we should offer $11 billion at 1.5% interest. And we should basically undercut the Chinese offers. And our economies, especially if the U.S. and Europe and Russia combine, and Japan and South Korea, if we really combine against China, our economies are much bigger than China's economy. We'll be able to offer bigger loans to countries at lower interest rates. We'll be able to outcompete China on the market. Unfortunately, if China is bribing officials, those officials can still take the bad Chinese deals. So we also need a very, very robust intelligence operation to find out who's being bribed, how they're being bribed, and we need to make that public to the people of the states in which there are bribes or such corruption. Yes. Well, yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Do you think that, are you optimistic that liberal values can combat this threat?
I'm not sure. I hope so, because otherwise we're headed towards a dark authoritarian future globally. So let's just hope that people have liberal values that work hard to forestall that eventuality. Yeah.
Do you feel that the public hysteria towards the nation of China is in part due to its size? Because you talk about human rights violations and ethnic tension. There's a prime example of the Middle East as it pertains to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in America, there's overwhelming support for Israel, at least, in the Senate. Now, I think in the public sphere, sure, that the discourse has changed over the last few generations, but there is in no way, shape, or form going to anti-Israeli attitude. In America, it's quite mainstream to have an anti-Chinese attitude to varying extent. So ultimately, what I'm saying is, do you feel as an individual and academic colonist, can feel the kind of attitude for anybody, China being part of its size and potential to be a higher global scope?
Yes, I do think that its size and its potential to do global harm is driving public concern about China. We also, in the U.S., have a lot of public concern about Russia. That is arguably even more pronounced than public concern about China. It's only since Trump came to office that there's been a real focus on a change in focus to China. Democrats in the U.S. are traditionally very, very much more concerned about Russia and terrorism than China. Republicans are usually the ones who are more concerned about China.
I would personally argue as well that the kind of anti-Russian attitude from a Republican standpoint is kind of carried over the whole Soviet Union tension back when Reagan was the president, whereas the Democratic opposition to Russia nowadays, just from my perspective, is more from an opposition to any form of nationalism and the perceived lack of human rights equality for Russian minorities, maybe Chechens or Tatars. And obviously the opposition towards China from both angles, the fact that it's a massive player in the world that could be harming any given time. Whereas the opposition to Russia is kind of all a carry on from previous presidents, at least from a Republican standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, on the Russian side, I think both Republicans and Democrats are concerned, but I think it's the Republicans who are driving concern about China. And if you look into history, the Chinese are arguably influencing democratic politics through support to many corporations that fund the Democratic Party, and they've even, the Chinese have even, funded at some points the Clinton administration in 1996. Clinton was caught taking funds from Chinese sources, and that was. But now Chinese are funding both sides. So Bush was recently caught taking money from the Chinese. Bush. So they're trying to influence both sides, and arguably one reason why the U.S. hasn't reacted more strongly against China in the past is because China wields so much influence through corporate donations, mostly, I would say, corporate donations. Yes?
Thanks, but also considering China's, we spoke about BRI, and then obviously having the other belts in the Arctic, but also they are expanding into space. The Chinese space program only a month ago planted the first seeds on the moon, as well as that testing various rockets, and they are actually planning to go to Mars allegedly. And also their Beidou system, their Chinese GPS, is expanding rapidly. Is this mimicking the space race that we had between the USSR and the US long ago? And does Beidou have the same impacts on geopolitics as GPS and GLONASS did?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also, did you mention the Arctic? I mean, they're heavily going into the Arctic as well. So the Beidou is part of that. I mean, China, in order to compete militarily with the US, they have to have their own GPS system, and that's what Beidou is. And already you've got the Chinese Maritime Militia, which is fishing boats that are supersized. They're steel hulls instead of wooden hulls. They're reinforced. They ram other ships and sink other ships. Recently, a Vietnamese ship was sunk. A Vietnamese fishing boat was sunk near the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea by one of these ships, these Chinese ships. And they all use the Beidou systems, but they also turn them off so that nobody can see where they are. So normal commercial ships will always, they have transponders which always tell everyone where their location is. The Chinese Maritime Militia, which is hundreds of thousands of boats now, do not use these transponders. On these ships and on other ships, especially containerized ships, now the Chinese are putting missiles into containers that you can't see that it's a missile. It just looks like a normal containerized cargo. They can put that on container ships. Theoretically, they can put that on their hundreds of thousands of fishing maritime ships as well, though there's no evidence of that yet. But people are watching for that. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got two questions. First is America missing an opportunity to take more decisive action with regards to China, in a similar vein to opportunities that France or Britain, the UK might have had in the late 1930s to take action against Hitler? And then the second is the US intelligence community able to reorientate itself towards focusing on state espionage as opposed to focusing on non-state terror networks?
I think that the U.S. military and intelligence are both reorienting themselves, towards Russian and Chinese, especially Chinese, the Chinese threat. So when the new acting Secretary of Defense, Secretary Shanahan, came in, they asked him, well, what's your biggest top three threats that we're facing? He said, China, China, China. So I think that it's very clear in the U.S. that we're taking a much stronger point on China. But I think that, yes, over the past decade or so, as China has been very clearly changing the status quo, and let's remember, 1988, China killed about over 60 Vietnamese soldiers on South Johnson Reef, just massacred them and took the reef and then turned it into an airstrip for their military and a base. In 1995, China took Mischief Reef in the South China Sea and did the same thing. That's within the EEZ of the Philippines, which is a U.S. treaty ally. In 2012, China took Scarborough Shoal, which is only 150 miles or so away from Subic Bay, which is the former most important U.S. naval base in Asia. And we did nothing in all these cases. We just let it happen. So arguably, these are forms of appeasement that's only encouraged China to take more and more. They're doing the same in Himalayas now. They're trying to grab some territory from the teeny country of Bhutan, which is sandwiched between China and India. And we've been giving them technologies, and through their cyber intrusions, we just haven't pushed back enough. A cyber intrusion by a state like China where they steal military technology should be seen as an act of war, but we have done nothing to stop that. Very, very little. So we're going to see very soon. So part of what Trump is doing is with these tariffs, and hopefully these tariffs will turn into much stronger economic sanctions, is he's pushing back at China's most vulnerable spot. So by doing economic sanctions on China, especially if we can be joined by the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, we really could pressure China into reforming itself and being a responsible member of the international community without a lot of military risk. If we're forced to militarily oppose China, which is becoming more likely over time, the risk of nuclear war looms very large. So we really are missing an opportunity right now to take economic action against China. And if we fail to seize this economic opportunity, we're going to risk nuclear war in the future, arguably. Yeah.
So, from what I'm gathering earlier, you're for freeing Europe, which was implied that you prefer Britain remains within the European Union. But I'm of the opinion that we'd be better off leaving based on sovereignty legislation or standards arguments here. I feel like we can go with ourselves. But then there's this looming security threat, which I've not seen until recently. And I was wondering, in the case of Britain exiting the EU, what would you like to see happen? What plans are there in place in order to help safeguard against the possibility of backing up the Chinese economy?
Well, we still have NATO, and so even if Britain leaves the EU, we still have a defense union. And even if Britain leaves the EU, that doesn't mean that Europe cannot have a unified military and foreign defense.
I'm talking in terms of financial influence, so we could choose to deal with EU or whatever sort of bloc might be. I'm not saying this because I'm totally on this, but it seems we need to draw out new trade agreements, and I would hope there'll be influence from outside sources to make it easier for us to make choices that would benefit international security.
Right. I think that the US, the EU, a potentially independent Britain, an independent Japan and South Korea need to all come into the same room and agree to joint and very strong economic sanctions on China to reform them, hopefully in the direction of democratization. I mean, they really need to start making progress on democratization before we should let up the pressure on them.
Is there any talk about a unified global economic area beyond the EEZ? Or?
I think you should write that up as an idea. Sure.
I've seen a couple of YouTube videos, that's all I've done.
Write it up, yeah. Yes?
So you just mentioned about the economic reformation of China through sanctions. Do you not think that potentially the sort of communist dialectical materialism is so baked into their mindset that they'll just see that as a threat, as actionable as actual violence? Because I believe that's kind of the Marxist hypothesis. And to deny finance and material is kind of in their eyes as bad as direct violence potentially.
Well, I think that's true. In Japan, before World War II, we blockaded their oil, which they saw as an act of war, and that's part of what precipitated their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So if we essentially blockaded China economically, they could see that as an act of war. I don't think there's much they could do about it, though. I mean, they depend, and their elites depend on economic flows, economic trade flows. So if they turn that into a war, it would get even worse, both for economic trade, which would shut down entirely, and there would be the added military threat of military escalation and nuclear war. So I think if we gradually, or not so gradually, impose economic sanctions on them and threats to them, that they will be forced to cry uncle. The big question is whether our elites will do that. I mean, China is truly, as soon as Trump got elected, China started doing trade deals with his family, giving his family various benefits in terms of trademarks and things like that in China. Or real estate deals. I mean, it was very blatant what they were trying to do. So the real question is not so much, is it in the interests of the Western world to impose these kinds of economic sanctions? The real question is, will Western leaders be co-opted by China and therefore not impose these economic sanctions? And I think that's what we're seeing, when you look in D.C. right now at people like Peter Navarro, who's basically promoting more tariffs or more economic sanctions on China, and he's threatening to leave the administration if the deal doesn't go, if we don't maintain strong economic tariffs and sanctions on China. That would be wise, because he thinks that that the administration might be compromised by big Wall Street banks or big corporations like Boeing and Apple, or China's side payments via trademarks to the Trump family. So that's the big question, really. Yes?
China currently, they have 260 companies signed up to Kofi Annan's Global Compact, of which most are state-owned. This is under half what the US have, 548. They are all private. So this isn't just a case where China are leading, in a sense, having more public companies trying to be sustainable. China have also signed the Paris Accords, US hasn't. China have also signed the Kyoto Protocol, and the US hasn't. And you also have the instances of BRI investments, and in particular the Angola model, even though that's very two-faced how it works, with debt, etc. But people there get better services, such as in Burkina Faso and Sri Lanka, and they get better job opportunities, and there's more cash flow. So this Chinese expansion, well, it may threat the US as a state. How is it a threat to humanity in general? Aren't they contributing to a more peaceful international world where people have opportunities and companies are responsible?
Well, I think the devil is in the details. So if you look at one country that I've looked at very, very closely is the Philippines. And in the Philippines, the loans that are being offered to the Philippines are very opaque. We don't know all the details. What details are released, we see there are high interest rates. The deals are associated with potential bribery of the leaders in terms of side benefits and contracts given to family members or close friends. And so they're not really good for the Filipino people, these deals that are being offered. They're framed as very good. Another example is there's a river project that is getting a big loan right now in the Philippines. That river project, if it's not paid back, is the collateral for that river project includes all the natural resources that the Philippines has. So legally, technically, if there's a dispute on that loan project, and what's being offered are hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans to the Philippines, if the Philippines cannot pay all of that money back, and that's a lot of money for a small country, then it's adjudicated in Beijing, in a Beijing court, where the Chinese on the adjudication panel will be the majority. So you know how that decision is going to go. And the collateral that China could attach would be the oil and gas in the South China Sea within the current Philippine exclusive economic zone. Now, China has threatened Duterte with war if he develops his own oil and gas in his own exclusive economic zone. Duterte himself said that Xi Jinping threatened war. So China cannot be seen as a peaceful development force globally. It's exactly the opposite. Its story, what it's trying to promote in terms of its image, is as a peaceful, developing, country that promotes development above all else. But what's actually happening is Chinese mercantilism, neo-colonialism. I mean, there are a lot of illegal Chinese immigrants into the Philippines right now. There's a lot of illegal drugs being flowed into the Philippines from China. Duterte is using this drug crisis as an excuse to kill, I think, over 20,000 people in cold blood, extrajudicial murders of supposed drug users. He's released a hit list of politicians who are supposedly in the pocket of drug lords. So the fear in the Philippines is so high right now that people don't feel comfortable speaking up. They see their country being sold to China on the cheap, and they can't speak up about it for fear of being put on a list or killed as a drug user. So it's absolutely the opposite, and you have to look into the details of countries to be able to see what's actually going on. And then you apply the details that you know about the countries and you start to see a pattern in other countries as well. Yeah.
Just want to, maybe the end, do you see that in China we can have another Tiananmen, or do you see that it is possible that the end of Tiananmen can be different nowadays?
I think that if there were another pro-democracy movement in China today, that there would be another Tiananmen, another massacre. And I think we're seeing that in Xinjiang in terms of, Xinjiang is actually another, people asking for their freedom, and they're getting brutally killed, detained. I mean, it's outrageous what's happening in Xinjiang in terms of 1 to 3 million detentions. Yeah.
But I'm thinking that if there was another Tiananmen, probably with many people dying, because that's what they will be able to do, would be in some way a positive thing to raise the conscious international awareness about China, because at the moment China gets a much more positive reception than because it's the rich country, it's the country that can bring richness, and the aspect of dictatorship, of brutality, is much less in the front line.
Right. Well, I mean, what happened with the last Tiananmen was the businessmen, saw what was happening, didn't really care, and were chomping at the bit to get back into China and start making money again. And the political leaders, including in the UK and the US, were exactly the same. They were following their business buddies and trying to downplay human rights issues and forget about Tiananmen. Within a couple of years, it was all back to normal, and we weren't allowed to say Tiananmen, Tibet, or Taiwan. We're just not allowed to say those words in polite company. this is what happened. So no, I don't think that another Tiananmen would lead to any positive results. I think that we've seen what happens when there's a democracy movement in China. The Communist Party destroys and kills that democracy movement. And so now the international community, if they want to change China and protect themselves, are going to have to do it themselves. We can't rely on Chinese people in China to get slaughtered again. We're in a much safer position on the outside of China to impose economic sanctions, and through economic sanctions, force democratization. All right, I think maybe that's the last question.
I think that's it.
It's a good thing to end on. Thank you very much, guys. We'll talk.